You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to The Andrew Lawton Show. We've spoken a fair bit about the upcoming equalization referendum that Albertans will be able to participate in October. I spoke about this with Premier Jason Kenney a few weeks back. And one of the big questions is if Albertans decide to vote in favor of this, to basically reevaluate Alberta's relationship with the rest of Canada as it pertains to equalization, does the federal government even have to pay attention to it? There was a great op-ed in the National Post looking at this very question, and it said the feds will have a duty to listen if Albertans vote against equalization. This was written by Dr. Bill Bewick, the Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, who joins me now. Bill, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So what is the question? Let's start there. What is it that Albertans are actually going to be voting on in October?
The question will be asking if Albertans want to remove the section from the Constitution that affirms a principle of making equalization payments.
And this is a federal program, not a provincial one. So we get now to the enforceability of it. If Albertans do vote overwhelmingly or even narrowly for this, what does that compel the government to do, if anything, at the federal level?
Well, there's some dispute about that, but in the 1998 Supreme Court reference case regarding Quebec secession, they of course went further into what secession would entail. But a few times in that judgment, they just sort of affirmed a general principle that if there's a province that's so upset about something in the Constitution that it's causing enough political consternation in a province that they have a referendum to change the Constitution, that the rest of the country needs to pay attention to that. And the federal government and the other provinces have a duty to engage in discussions, engage in constitutional discussions, it says at one point. And it's just sort of common sense that if you have, any of your partners in Confederation are that upset about something and they have a referendum where the people's will explicitly says that this isn't just, some politicians trying to score points, or it's not just somebody, doing political purposes. This is the people are upset enough that they want some change, that you can't just ignore it, and that you have to engage with the province in good faith and discuss the problem.
But you don't have to go along with it. You have to have a discussion.
Of course,
is that basically the standard?
There's an amending formula for the Constitution, and that this does not in any way meet that threshold of 7 provinces and 50%. But it's just a way of, arguably letting off steam, but more importantly, in re-engaging with a province that has a real problem and is frustrated and needs something addressed. So it's just kind of common sense that you wouldn't just brush that off in a way that it's probably easier to brush off a political leader who's asking the feds for something. Maybe he's in a different party. Maybe there's other motives going on. But when the people of a province speak up loudly that they need something addressed, the federal government has a duty to address it.
And that's actually a very key point, because a few weeks back when Premier Jason Kenney was sitting down with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Premier Kenney had put to him the upcoming Alberta Senate elections, which are also going to be in October, and had asked Trudeau to hold off on appointing any senators for Alberta until Albertans could put a candidate forward. And Trudeau basically said, yeah, that's not how we do things, and gave, to use your words, the brush off there. So in that sense, having an obligation to, no, you're going to sit down, you're going to talk about this, forces you to respond to it, because then, voters, other premiers, the media can ask you, okay, well, what did he say? What did you say to him? And I think there's an obligation to at least take something out of it if you have to go into that engagement process.
Yeah, and another example is the another sort of thing that critics of this approach point to is, why can't you just bring it up with the premiers at the Council of the Federation? Why can't you just work through the normal channels? And I would say, well, one, there's about 5 provinces who receive a lot of their funding from this, or at least a significant chunk that they're not going to want to just go. They don't want any negotiations because they're pretty happy with how things are. But there are 5 other provinces that are paying into this without getting anything. So you could have a little 5-on-5 at the Premier's conference, but when you look at 2019, the Alberta government did get every single Premier to unanimously agree to give Alberta a significant retroactive payment of $5-6 billion, because in 2015 Alberta's revenues dropped $8 billion. That was 20% drop in revenues. And so there's this program called fiscal stabilization that is meant to cushion the blow when you have a sudden drop in revenues like that. But it was it had a 60 per person cap, $60 per person, which meant that Alberta got $250 million on that $8 billion drop, which was about a 3% insurance payment, which is obviously not stabilizing anything. And so partly out of recognition for all that Albertans have contributed to other provinces through our taxes that we pay, which is much more than we get back, the rest of the premiers said, please give Alberta this retroactive pay, like change the program, which could benefit all of them conceivably, but give Alberta a retroactive payment, which obviously only helps Alberta. And it's pretty unusual, I think, to get every premier to agree to give one province money. I mean, it's easy to get them to all agree to ask the feds to give them all more money, but this was a pretty significant win, and the feds just ignored it. So I don't know. I mean, part of this is for those who criticize the process, well, what would you do? Because the status quo isn't good enough. There's a lot of people in Alberta that are getting increasingly frustrated. I put out posts on these topics, and the number of people who are so upset that they want to leave the country that speak up is troubling. So we have a serious problem here, and it's not just it's too easy, I think, for some politicians and groups in Canada to sort of write off Alberta, demonize Alberta, mock Alberta, but that's not going to last much longer before more serious things happen. So I feel like this referendum is a really good sort of first step in saying, hey, we're not happy. Can we get this addressed?
Yeah, and I think you are right to point out that chapter in Canada where other provinces had agreed to give Alberta money, because that actually reinforces that the equalization formula does not entirely capture the economic realities. And this is still a problem that Alberta is contending with now, where the economic situation in Alberta, which has been hit not just by the pandemic, like many other provinces, but oil and gas related issues as well, it's still not being reflected in the equalization formula. So even if someone is committed to equalization, surely they should be able to look and say, the way we do this isn't really working right now.
Yeah, so there's two things going on here. One is the symbolic attempt to get some recognition for all that Albertans have contributed and how little we've gotten back from the country for decades. Mm-hmm. But then, so this is an avenue to address that. But equalization is seriously flawed. The provinces since 2015 have come much closer together in fiscal capacity, is the way they measure the kind of wealth and ability to pay for services. Alberta, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, we used to lead the country in 2015, and it's really come down with the energy downturn, so that the provinces it was about a $5,000 gap between the median have and have not. Now it's about $1,600. And when you think of the different costs of services in places like the Maritimes and Quebec versus Ontario and Vancouver and Alberta, that's basically nothing. So the provinces are more close together than ever, which means equalization is less necessary than ever, if at all. I would argue maybe New Brunswick and PEI are far enough below the average that maybe something there would be fair. But Quebec and Ontario are getting increasingly close, especially if you use a factor like the cost of services. So it's less necessary than ever, and yet the payments have grown to $21 billion this year. They're tied to GDP, and they grow every year regardless of the need. And so we've got massive payments going out, at least $10 billion more than what is justified, which means that there's just $10 billion that all Canadians are paying into that are going just to 30% of the country to pay for provincial services. And this is at a time when Alberta is saying, we need more funding for provincial services. Ontario is saying, we need more funding for provincial services. Well, you're paying for provincial services a lot more than you think. It's just that Ottawa is sending those dollars specifically to 5 provinces.
One of the concerns that I've seen from this, and you touched on it a bit earlier when you talked about the independent sentiment, is that a lot of people that think this doesn't go nearly far enough, that think, you know what, the problems are not going to be fixed. They're certainly not going to be fixed now. And it seems like there's a bit of resistance to this referendum that's coming from the other side of it, from the independents. And I'm curious, as someone in Alberta, how much you see that as being a factor here.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the frustration. It is frustrating, but at the same time, we're only sort of 11.5% of the country. We have to understand, and we have sort of different interests than a lot of than other sections of the country. So there is a sort of systemic issue that we will always have to deal with. And so I do understand why people think it's fruitless and hopeless and will never get anywhere near close enough. But from our perspective is that we need to try, and there isn't really too many groups that have really tried to do what we're doing, which is telling the rest of Canada the facts, saying here's how much Albertans have been contributing, here's how vital Alberta's economy and economic prosperity has been to the rest of the country, here's all the spillover effects when it comes to either taxes or jobs that the rest of the country benefits from. And just try to shift the perspective for the rest of the country from thinking that somehow Alberta's lucky and has a bunch of free money and that somehow their success comes at our expense, and say, no, Alberta's energy sector is a huge source of productivity. And when it's functioning well, the spillover effects for the rest of the country are enormous. And so, get people to realize that a good Alberta is really good for the whole country, and that the country needs that prosperity right now more than ever as we try to come out of this COVID mess. And so we're going to do a good faith exercise here, and we'll see where that can get us.
Bill Bewick, Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, great op-ed in the National Post called "If Albertans Vote Against Equalization, the Feds Will Have a Duty to Listen." Bill, thanks so much for coming on. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Andrew. And it's a pretty critical time in the next few months here, so I encourage people to go to fairnessalberta.ca and see the information we're providing. And we can only function on the generosity of donors, so please consider a donation if you like what we're doing.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
That was Bill Bewick of Fairness Alberta. We've obviously been covering Alberta independence because no one else in the mainstream media is in any substantive way. And when they do, it's oftentimes through the lens of, oh, look at these, disgruntled hillbillies, not realizing the very real concerns and very long-standing concerns that people in the West have. And it isn't just about Alberta. It's about a province's ability, a province's right to assert its own agenda. And it's interesting that we have all of these politicians that will tiptoe around Quebec, refuse to tell Quebec no, but when Alberta tries to do the same thing, in fact, not even the same thing, a pared down version of it, it gets mocked and vilified. So that's why we're standing up, and I hope you'll continue to as we head towards the referendum in October.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.